lot I want to talk about. I will put timestamps in the description, so if you want to jump around, you can. I broke it up into sections. First section, we can talk about the new technologies that we see incorporated, things like social media, which I thought were quite interesting. Second section, I'll talk about the theme of happiness versus free will and why that relates to the book they chose to make such a big part of the movie, Dostoyevsky's book, The Underground Man. Third section, I want to talk about Michael Shannon's character briefly and why I thought it was kind of interesting what they did with him. Fourth section, I'll talk about things I really didn't like about the movie. In particular, I don't think they fleshed out enough just why books are important and why reading is important versus video, movies, these other forms of entertainment. Now, fifth section, I'll talk about the ending and just what the movie is trying to get across. So the first thing the movie explored that I liked a lot is how censorship would be so different with the internet and in the digital age versus a time when things were more physical and you could actually burn books out of existence. Now, if somebody wants to censor information, you can certainly try to get rid of all digital traces of it, but a much more effective and practical strategy is to use information overload instead and try to just flood so much information out there on a topic and then make sure that the information that shows up in the top search results is the information that you want to show up. And that's a far more effective way to limit people's access to information you don't want them to have than actually trying to get rid of it. So Blumhouse, they came out with a movie called Truth or Dare, came out recently, and they certainly did. When people put negative reviews out there, they did use copyright and get them to take the videos down if they, for instance, used a poster or something that technically you're not supposed to. But a far more effective strategy that I saw them using is they would write a script out with all the best hashtags and keywords. They would say ending explained, demon origins explained. Then they would send the script out to different YouTubers, review websites, and basically these people would just read off this script and maybe a few flourishes here or there, put their own spin on it, and then Blumhouse would allow them to use all this great footage and other resources to make their videos very polished, very good. So what that's doing is any of those negative reviews, Blumhouse doesn't have to censor those reviews. All they have to do is flood the top 10 search results with all these videos, articles that are positive to them simply by, like I say, them having the best hashtags, them having all these great promotional materials and photos and images that Blumhouse has let these reviews use. So it's one example of how, in this case, Blumhouse was using both. They were using the censorship and the copyright strikes, but also just flooding out positive information and making sure that information is the information that gets out there. So in some ways, the internet makes censorship so much harder because anyone can put information out there. There's so much information available, so many more different viewpoints, presumably. But if there's so much information on any given topic that only the top 10 search results really matter, and that's the only thing people are really seeing, and tech companies are able to very subtly tinker with algorithms to make sure the information that they want to get out there is what appears in those top 10 results. In some ways, you have a form of censorship that is so much more subtle and so much more insidious and hard to see and hard to fight. Now, I love how book burning becomes, in the movie, it is one way of getting rid of the information, but also it's this kind of public spectacle that unites people in their hate of free thought and their love of authoritarian government. So I loved how they linked that with social media. And you see social media mobs where it reminds me a lot, there used to be public executions. And that was a huge thing through much of human history where someone would face justice for a crime and the whole community would gather and unite in their hatred of that person. Now, that was done away with, and we don't really see that anymore. But with social media mobs and kind of social media justice, kind of going back to this kind of very public, and that's the big difference. It's a very public form of punishment and kind of justice. So it's kind of interesting. I like how we see social media brought up, and we also see with social media, it's so much shorter. When you look at Twitter, not just the character limit, but the fact that GIFs are so popular, it's just the kind of condensing of thought and making it as efficient as possible and as competitive as possible, where the only tweets that get seen are the ones that get the most likes and most retweets. So it's such a contrast to literature as a form of art, where books are not always very efficient. There's oftentimes words, sentences that could be taken out and you wouldn't really lose any meaning in a technical sense. But there's something about the flaws and the imperfections that make them so magical to people, and you compare art to a product where it's all about efficiency, it's all about customer immediate response and likes and things like social media, but also things like Spark Notes. Very interesting. In some ways, people love Spark Notes, and they bring these books, these ideas to a much wider audience than they'd otherwise reach. But in some sense, is this streamlined, more efficient version, is there something lost that's very important? And most comically, we see Moby Dick reduced and abridged down to a series of emojis. And it just drives home that point that you might look at a series of images and get a rough idea of the facts of what Moby Dick's about, what the actual events of the story are. But unless you read it, you don't get any sense of the feeling, the significance, the meaning, the texture, just what's important about it. So that was great. Other really good additions, the exiles, rather than actually them sending them out and exiling them in a physical sense, they would just delete their profiles, and we get the sense of if everyone's connected and linked into this network and everything's on credit, and in some ways that makes things, again, very efficient, but also if you want to really delete someone and have someone be completely excommunicated from society, all you have to do is just a click of a button and deleting their profile and their ability to get credit, get a job, interact with people. So it was a little update on what exiling someone would look like in a society that's super connected and super linked into this state-controlled internet. In this case, it was called the Nine. Now, the theme of free will versus happiness, there's that quote that Montag's reading from the book, Notes from the Underground, that says, "I want the freedom to say 2 + 2 = 5." Now, the whole introduction to Notes from the Underground, it's a critique of the idea of creating a utopia. And it doesn't say, Dostoyevsky doesn't say that humans, well, we just aren't clever enough to come up with a utopia, that any kind of utopia we try to come up with, because humans we're flawed and kind of stupid, it's going to turn into a dystopia. No, Dostoyevsky says that even if we were able to come up with a utopia, perfect society where happiness was maximized and everything was very efficient and very well organized, there's something fundamental to the human condition that resists perfection and in some ways kind of craves struggle, craves misery, craves unhappiness. And then Michael Shannon's character, I thought it was really interesting characterization when we see him writing down these thoughts about the nature of reality and how painful reality and consciousness really is, and then burning these little pieces of paper. It just drives home this point that book burning, this idea of censorship, it can be a way to have social control, kind of a government controlling people, but can also on a personal level just be a way of coping and not really feeling things, not really facing reality, kind of deadening reality and just making it through. And we see this in the book a lot with television being kind of similar to pharmaceutical drugs and kind of lulling us and making us not feel things as painfully. And it's compared to poetry as a kind of way to feel things in a really extreme way. And that brings me to my next point, where the things I didn't like about the movie was I feel it didn't do enough to kind of convey the joy of reading and literature and poetry and how it's different than cinema. And I get that you can't do that too much, because then you open yourself up to critique. A book that is all about how important reading and books are and how toxic television and just kind of passively receiving entertainment this way is, how can you adapt that into a movie with a straight face? And I think you have to address it. It would have been better if they would have addressed it and made it a stronger critique of television and that form of media versus books, even if it seems a little strange to do that in a movie. And it's not just that I feel like they didn't do enough to critique television and passive consumption of media. I feel like they didn't really show a love of books and a love of literature. They could have really fleshed out when Montag, he's barely seen any books at this point, and then he experiences a library. And just seeing that and seeing the weight of the books and just the feeling, it could have been such a moment where they fleshed out a bit, but they could have just fleshed out how, honestly, for some people walking into a library and just seeing all the accumulated knowledge, it can be an almost mystical religious experience, and they could have fleshed that out more. They could have brought up books in a way where you have characters talking about, their first time reading something, falling in love with books. It felt like they were just name dropping all these books that, and again, it's very ironic, it seemed like they were just name dropping books that were kind of market tested to appeal and not piss anyone off, kind of have a representative sample of books, rather than any single character really talking passionately about a book they loved. It seemed like a boardroom kind of got together and picked the best, market tested, that's going to appeal to the most people list of books, without none of the people involved in the project had read any of those books, really cared about them at all. So I thought that was unfortunate. And then the politics of it, I feel like they tried to either not really explore any of the politics that were maybe controversial. So the original book, part of the reason that there was censorship, it wasn't just government wanted to control and kind of stamp out thought. No, part of it was there was a lot of things that people found offensive in books, and they didn't like how maybe their group was portrayed. So censorship started with banning this book because people didn't like this aspect of it, and then we're going to ban this book because another group doesn't like that aspect. So this idea of kind of political correctness being part of the push for censorship, that was touched upon in one line in the movie, but then completely moved away from, never really engaged with. And the politics that we get a somewhat comical like Trump quote where it's like burn to make America great again or something. I forget the exact quote. It was like burn. It was terrible, just terrible quote. And I feel like they took these ideas like censorship, social media culture, and they tried to apply it specifically to Trump supporters, when Trump's a very polarizing figure. He has at best kind of half the country's support. So the idea that a government could have popular, almost near universal, in the dystopia we see here, almost all the society is united in these beliefs, and there's a very, very, very small resistance group. So the idea that a society that was united and all united around these things and these very broad trends and very broad social factors, to pin them on just one specific person, one very specific subset of politics. No, I think that it would have been much stronger if you kind of showed how, if this was going to happen, you would get some kind of new coalition that would form, and you'd see different people from different political ideologies. They would find some common ground and kind of unite. And it was interesting, I was reading an article where it said some of the characters from the book, like Montag's wife, they were left out because in our context they could potentially be seen as misogynistic and offensive. So they were left out, and they said it was probably a good thing they left it out and moved on. And I just couldn't believe it's a book. And the person who's right, they probably know this, the whole book is about censorship and censorship based on ideas potentially being offensive. And in their review of an adaptation of this book where they've taken out certain things, and they say it's because, it could potentially be offensive. And they don't even acknowledge that and say, hey, I get that, yeah, seems a little weird for me to be advocating censorship, but nonetheless, I'm still going to write it. No, they just, no self-awareness, they just write that. But anyways, last thing I want to talk about before I get to the ending, something, it's not a big deal, just stuck out to me. The one Asian character, when they're going around and saying which books they've memorized, her book is Chairman Mao's little red book. Now, first of all, it's like, why does the one Asian character have to Chairman Mao? That has to be their book. And also, I maybe the little red book is quite a good book. I haven't read it, but Chairman Mao is and then last thing I want to say before I explain the ending, something that just stuck out to me, I thought it was a little interesting. The one Asian character, when they're going around and asking what books each of them memorized, her book is Chairman Mao, I think the little red book. And the Chairman Mao, responsible for the Cultural Revolution, which, was people just ransacking and destroying so much history, artifacts, culture. It's like the quintessential historical event of just the tragedy of destroying a country's cultural legacy. So to include that book within in a movie that's all about preserving history, preserving artifacts, preserving our heritage, it just was so perplexing to me. I don't know if anyone else noticed that, but anyways, moving on to explaining the ending. So we have this project called OMNIS. Now, OMNIS, Latin for all, words like omnipresent, that's the Latin prefix for all, everything. What they're going to do is they're going to put strands of DNA within animals, and these strands are going to be able to get decoded, and you're going to be able to put all the information that humans have, and we're going to put them in different animals, and then what we see is the animals mating. And it's going to spread throughout the whole flock in the case of the bird. And this is how we're going to have information that can never be destroyed. And it's not that the information is going to spread and instantly it's going to spread and people are going to be able to consume it. But there's the potential for that to happen in the future. And that's what I like so much about the ending, is it drives home the point that technology, it's a double-edged sword. So you could have technology create the atomic weapons that would destroy all of society and everything that we built, but we also see technology having the potential to store everything that the atom bombs would destroy it, and store it in a way that potentially at some date in the future it could be recreated. And in that sense, all these books, all this effort that people have put, in some cases their entire lives into, the hope is still there that it could get recreated at some point. Now, maybe it never will. Maybe society would regress and it would never get to the point again where all this stuff that was stored in the DNA could get decoded. But there is the hope. As long as that exists in the DNA, there's the hope that it could be decoded by some advanced society and someday people could read it again. So even if no one is reading the books now, even if no one reads the books for 200 years, 400 years, 1,000 years, as long as that DNA exists, again, there's still the hope. And I think that's the real beauty of it. And I think it's so interesting to compare this to the book ending. So the ending of the book, we see the memorization method being used, where each person is going to memorize a book, and that's how we're going to make sure that this information gets passed down. Now, you compare it to the DNA method. The DNA method, it's so much more efficient. You see how one person can maybe memorize one book, versus the DNA method, one cell of one person could hold theoretically almost all of human knowledge. So it's so interesting, you see the different perspectives on who's going to prefer which method. Now with the DNA method, like I say, so much more efficient, but in some sense it's so like impersonal, and it seems like the information, yeah, technically the information still exists, but it's so removed from any kind of human and any kind of passion. With the memorization method, maybe one person, they only remember one book, but nonetheless, they know that book, they probably love that book, they could probably share their love and passion so much easier. So it's interesting, you start to get, and again, it's the idea of there's stuff that's efficient and streamlined and technically better, but there's some kind of intangible quality that has maybe been lost a bit. And that's why I think some people might prefer the book ending a lot more to the movie ending. And I think it gets to that divide where for some people, just the preservation of things like music, books, just the preservation itself, it's good in and of itself. Even if no one is reading these great books, the fact that we have libraries and we have this knowledge preserved for future generations, that's good in and of itself. Because even if no one's reading them now, maybe at some point in the future, some people would read them, and they would see the fact that we can now store so much music and so many songs. A single iPod can hold just countless numbers of songs. They would say that is just wonderful and good in and of itself. For other people, they would say it's not about the preservation, it's not about the actual things existing, it's much more about how many people are actually right now in our culture enjoying these things, experiencing these things. So they would say having everything exist digitally. In music, yeah, we have more music being preserved and passed down than ever before, but in some sense they would say there's less records that people just love and treasure, and there's less appreciation of the stuff. So they would say that it's not really about just preserving, it's more about just increasing in each generation the number of people that are really falling in love with this stuff. And for these people, they would say storing all these books within the DNA of animals, yeah, it's very poetic, it's very efficient, but wouldn't it be better even if you're able to have less books be passed down, but through the memorization method, by everyone picking a book and memorizing? It's like, yeah, you're not going to be able to pass down every book, you're not going to be able to pass down as many as the other method, but isn't the fact that we have a world with more people who know more books and love more books and are able to pass on this knowledge, isn't that a better world than a world where, yeah, technically more is getting passed down, but now we have people obsessing over DNA and beakers rather than actually the stuff, and suddenly the focus becomes on the preserving itself rather than the actual thing. And I think that's a huge problem in our culture, where we have people who, they say they love books, they say they love literature, they have these great libraries, but they never open the books, they never go inside the books, they just drag the books around from house to house to house. And in a sense, it's like a perversion where it's all about owning the books, and it's all about having them, and it's all about, you know, moving them around and having them exist, but not actually enjoying them. But I will say the imagery of the bird flying into the flock, it was great symbolism for the way that knowledge, it's so easy to spread and pass from one person to the other, and it gives hope. And that was another reason I found the ending very hopeful, that yes, maybe the forces, there's going to be so much power, the forces that want to control information, maybe they have so much more power than the people that want to spread it. But in some ways, sometimes you could say it's easier to destroy than create, and that's kind of bleak, but in some ways it's so much easier to spread information than destroy it. It's so easy for us to spread because we're so in some ways we're bad at communication, but we have these abilities of communication, this ability to spread knowledge. So in some ways, the fact that knowledge can spread so quickly from one person to another, it does give hope that even if there are people that are always going to want to stamp down and crack down and limit our ability to spread information, the forces that want to spread information, it seems like they're going to win out. And for the actual science of it, I don't know about the mating part, because I know that when two animals mate, the DNA gets kind of scrambled together and you get new DNA. So presumably as animals mate, you're going to get glitches, and eventually if you try to decode it, you're going to have all these typos and mistakes in the book. But in this case, they're adding a new strand to the cells of the animals, so there wouldn't be a corresponding strand in the animal that this animal's mating with, so maybe that strand is going to get passed down as is. But I know that it's totally a thing that they do that in real life. They are storing books and stuff like that as in DNA. Now, in some ways it seems really inefficient, because first you have to convert it to binary, which is just ones and zeros. So if you store the letter the, first you have to do the T, which the T might be 1001001, something like that. Then that's converted to DNA, which is ATCG. So they say all A's and T's are 1, all C's and G's are 0. So to store 1001001, you do T, C, T, C, T, C, T, C, T. And that is just the T. So you see how even to store one single book, it would take so many letters. You're just talking about so many letters, but DNA is so small, it's still in some sense practical, and in some ways it's a viable and valid storage method, even though it seems incredibly cumbersome. The actual just the size of DNA itself makes it kind of appealing. But anyways, those are my thoughts on the movie. Not perfect. I had a lot of complaints with it, but it did get me thinking. It did get me wanting to talk about a lot of stuff, make a video about it. So I guess in some sense it is doing something right.